back, everybody. Today we are starting a new video series on the Chrysler V8 engines. Chrysler, Plymouth, Dodge V8 engines. Now this is a pretty big subject, mainly because there's a lot to go through and decipher when it comes to Chrysler. And so there's a couple of things about the Chrysler Corporation that I think is really important to understand in order to understand the origins of the Chrysler V8 engines. Walter P. Chrysler, who was the founder of the Chrysler Corporation, was a very unique individual in that he was a very big proponent of engineering. He was actually, one of the quotes that he made early on was, he said that I will surround myself with the greatest minds in the world in engineering. And he did exactly that. He actually recruited 3 of the top engineers in the company who were working for Studebaker at the time. These 3 engineers became known as the 3 Musketeers: Frederick Zeter, Owen Skelton, and Carl Breer. Now these engineers had come up together in engineering school. Walter Chrysler noticed some of the innovations that they had come up with. While they were working for Studebaker, they had come up with some really innovative ideas that were never seen before. And so he said, he looked at what they had done, things like putting a temperature gauge on the dash in the vehicle, which was completely unheard of at that time, putting a battery gauge and an electronic gas gauge on the dash so you knew how much gas you had. To us, those are novel things, but at the time in the early 1900s, these were like groundbreaking innovations. And so these guys were on the forefront of engineering, and they really did work well together and think outside of the box. And so Chrysler recruited these. We could do a whole video on the engineers that worked for Chrysler, the team of engineers that they assembled. They also started an engineering school called the Chrysler Institute. And they looked all over the world actually for engineers, and they allowed a handful of engineers each year to come into the Chrysler Institute. And along with their engineering jobs for Chrysler, the 3 Musketeers created a mentorship program. The Chrysler Institute started as a very modest plan that Walter P. Chrysler had to train engineers in-house. And it turned into the Chrysler Institute, which ended up having thousands of students over the years. And the Chrysler Institute is one of the reasons that talking about Chrysler history and talking about the innovations and talking about the Chrysler V8 engines is probably going to take 3 complete videos, mainly because there was teams of engineers that were given different assignments under the name of Dodge and DeSoto and Chrysler, and they all came up with their own innovations and their own engines and their own vehicles. Today we look at Chrysler as the parent company of Dodge. Plymouth is gone now, of course, and you know, they're all pretty much the same company. They were the same company back in the early days. However, the Dodge and the DeSoto line, which was owned by Chrysler, and the Plymouth and the Chrysler, these were all factions of the same company, and they all had their own cars, their own engines, and they all had their own team of separate engineers from the Chrysler Institute that were given the assignments to design and build these vehicles for this particular branch of Chrysler. And because of that, a lot of the innovations in the engines that they produced were similar, but not interchangeable. Once we get into talking about the first V8s they produced, it will become very apparent when we go through the list of the different companies that there was a completely different group of engineers working on each one of these different V8 engines and vehicles. And so because of that, there's a lot more information to go through. Very different from, say, General Motors, who basically had the same small block V8, you know, for 70 years, and everything was interchangeable. Dodge, Chrysler, Plymouth, DeSoto is a very, very different company and a very different type of manufacturing from Ford and GM. Without getting into, you know, an hour-and-a-half long video about the history of the engineering school and the engineers that work for Dodge, because that's not really what this is about, but literally you could do a video. I would encourage you to, you know, just investigate the history of the Engineering Institute for Chrysler and all of the incredible innovations that they had. Many of the modern innovations that came into play in vehicles in the 1950s and 60s were basically innovations from the Chrysler Institute that Ford and GM copied. I know the Ford and GM guys are going to be like, no, they had their own engineers. Well, yes, they did, but many of that stuff was taken from the Chrysler Institute. In fact, many of the engineers that worked for GM and Ford actually were trained at the Chrysler Institute, believe it or not. There was literally thousands of engineers that were produced by the Chrysler Institute because Walter P. Chrysler was committed to mentoring and training engineers. What's crazy, this is, nowadays you say, I'm going to go to engineering school, and they're like, well, you need to get financial aid and you got to have, a grant and a loan and this and that. Walter P. Chrysler, the young men that were selected to be in the Chrysler Institute were actually paid an engineer's salary by Chrysler while they were being trained, which is incredible. I mean, that just never happened anywhere before. It was so a lot of the stuff that Chrysler did was very innovative, and it was just cutting edge. Nobody had ever done it before. And so because of that, this is why we have all of the diversity and all of the different lines under the Chrysler Corporation and all of the innovations they came up with. It really is incredible what they accomplished. Whether you're a Dodge or a Chrysler guy or not, you have to admit that once you delve into what Chrysler actually did, he was a huge player and influencing all of the automotive industry in American history, including General Motors, AMC, and Ford. They were very highly influenced by these engineers that were trained by Chrysler. Because these Chrysler brands had different groups of engineering, we have to look at what they did and what they produced separately. So we're going to separate them. We're going to start with Chrysler. Now, in 1951, Chrysler developed their first overhead valve V8 engine. Now, this is very different from the other manufacturers in that Ford and GM basically started out with their first V8s as being small blocks. Chrysler's just the opposite. Chrysler's first V8 or series of V8s was a big block. The small block Chrysler came later. So they started with the big Hemi engines. Even though they weren't necessarily really huge in cubic inch size, in fact some of them were quite small and had low horsepower, they still were physically a very large heavy engine, which was considered a big block, or which can be compared to the larger V8 engines of GM and Ford that they put in their big block category. The smaller configuration engines, or what would be known as the Chrysler small block, was not produced until years later. So in 1951, the first Chrysler V8 was produced, and it was a Hemi. Now we need to talk about what the Hemi engine is. The Hemi name is short for hemispherical. And actually the term or the name Hemi engine is actually trademarked by Chrysler and cannot be used by any other manufacturer. Now, I think it's important for everybody to understand that Chrysler is not the only one who has a Hemi, but they are the only company that is allowed to call their engine a Hemi, and they would like you to think they're the only ones that has a Hemi, because they trademarked the name Hemi, and it belongs to the Chrysler Corporation. And so if any other company says, hey, Ford says this is our Hemi, or GM says, we got a Hemi, which they do, they're going to get sued by Chrysler. And so the hemispherical combustion chamber is common in a lot of passenger cars, a lot of modern cars today. In fact, most four cylinders that have been produced in the last 25 years are actually Hemi type heads, but they can't call them Hemi, they call them a pent roof, because rather than having a hemispherical or a dome type chamber, they have a chamber that is shaped like a roof with multiple valves, 4 valves per cylinder, 5 valves per cylinder, like in the case of the Audi. Regardless of the fact, it is basically the same design of chamber And a lot of the attributes and benefits of this type of chamber are because of its design. For all-out power, just raw brute power and efficiency, the hemispherical or the Hemi type chamber is absolutely the best type of chamber there is across the board in the automotive industry, and that's why it is so widely used nowadays. The hemispherical chamber is a hemispherical or a roof-shaped chamber that has valves that are canted or laid over. Now, this laying over the valve has a lot of benefits. Number one, we lay the valves over at an extreme or a steep angle, which aims the port toward the middle of the chamber. It also creates cross-flow. The intake valve is on one side, the exhaust is on the other. So the air and fuel is actually all moving in one direction, from the intake side to the exhaust, which increases the flow capability of the head greatly. Additionally, laying the valves over at this canted angle allows you to have a much larger intake and exhaust valve, or a larger set of intake and exhaust valves in the case of the pent roof, without valve shrouding or without causing the valve to be blocked or shrouded by the edge of the combustion chamber, which is the case in the wedge type chambers. Valve shrouding was a big problem because the valves were upright, and if they were too close to the edge of the combustion chamber, it would just destroy the flow of the head. With the hemispherical design or the pent roof design, that problem was solved, and so the ability to run much larger valves or a larger set of valves, creating incredibly good flow, was a huge benefit. The other big benefit of the Hemi or the pent roof chamber is that the spark plug was in the center of the chamber. With some of the wedge type chambers or the bathtub type chambers that were also very widely used in a lot of engine designs by other manufacturers and even by Chrysler and some of their later engines, the spark plug was over to the edge of the combustion chamber, and this actually caused the flame front to have to travel all the way across the chamber, which created a longer burn time. And it also aimed the energy of the flame. Instead of aiming the energy of the flame directly down on the piston, it aimed the energy of the flame across the chamber. This was not as efficient at getting power, transferring power to the piston and the crankshaft. With the spark plug in the center or near the center of the hemisphere, the flame traveled outwards from the center in all directions, and so it actually cut the burn time of the combustion mixture in half. It was twice as fast, and so you could optimize your ignition timing and run a lot less timing, and that in turn is going to make a lot more power because of the quick burn time, and that really made a big difference in power output. The Hemi is legendary. All of the fastest top fuel dragsters and funny cars nowadays use the hemispherical design. When you go to the drag races and you see these 10, 11,000 horsepower engines, these are all Hemis. Every one of them is a Hemi. And so the Hemi design is utilized in some of the most powerful and efficient engines in the world, and it is and was a fantastic innovation. All right, so now let's get into this. So the first Hemi was developed and designed by Chrysler in 1951. Now again, we're going to go through the Chrysler Corporation lines, Chrysler, Dodge, DeSoto, and Plymouth, separately, because they literally did conduct themselves like separate manufacturers, even though they were part of the same company. Now, Chrysler developed their Hemi first. In 1951, it was the first Hemi V8 ever developed. In fact, it was the first V8 ever developed by Chrysler. The first one was the Chrysler line of Hemis was what was known as the Firepower Hemi. In 1951, Chrysler produced their first Firepower Hemi, which was 331 cubic inches. Now, the horsepower numbers were not all that impressive, especially considering the size and weight of this engine. It had 180 horsepower, and the torque is unknown. Now, one thing that you'll notice about Chrysler in the early days, especially in the 50s and 60s, they published their horsepower numbers of their engine, but they did not publish torque numbers. We don't really know. The only way we figured out what the torque of these engines was is to do independent dyno testing, but Chrysler never did produce the torque output of these engines. They used horsepower only. The 331 was produced from 1951 through 1955, and it had a bore and stroke combination of 3.812 on the bore and 3.625 on the stroke. Now this was what they considered the low deck block. It had a shorter deck than some of the later versions of it. The deck height was 10.385, which would be increased in some of the later versions of the engine for a longer stroke. The 2-barrel carbureted version of the 331 that they produced made the 180 horsepower version. They also had a high performance version of the 331 that made 300 horsepower with 2 4-barrel Carter carburetors, which was their hot rod version, and they actually bumped the compression ratio up and added the higher flow intake and dual carbs and a dual point distributor that really woke the 331 up and showed what its potential was. Now, what's interesting about the 331 is Chrysler also sold the 331 to a company that made air raid sirens. They attached the 331 to an air raid siren that actually to this day is the loudest and highest decibel air raid siren ever created in the history of the world. So that's pretty impressive, and there are some people that have actually collected those and restored them. If you want to see one of those things in action, just type in Chrysler air raid siren on YouTube, and it's actually a pretty entertaining video to watch them fire that thing up. Highest horsepower 331 was in the 300C in 1955. In 1956, Chrysler produced the 354 cubic inch engine. Now this was basically a 331 with a larger bore. They increased the bore to 3.937, but they kept the stroke the same as the 331. The 354 is one of the Hemis that's actually more well known. A lot of the restoration projects or nostalgia drag type projects will actually use a 354 Hemi to build up and put a supercharger on and put into a factory street early vintage type hot rod. So it was well known by many of the modern car enthusiasts. It had 3 horsepower levels, 280, 340 and 355. Now in the 1957 Chrysler 300B, the 354 produced 355 horsepower. This is 1 horsepower per cubic inch, and the 354 Hemi was actually the first American V8 to produce 1 horsepower per cubic inch. So it was a pretty amazing feat at the time. Now, another thing that Chrysler did with the 354 is they actually offered this engine with a different cylinder head. Chrysler had another type of cylinder head called the Poly. It was not a hemispherical head. It was a head that was much less expensive to produce. And so they offered a lower cost engine, what they called the polyspherical chamber. Some of the other divisions of Chrysler actually made a polyspherical engine that was very different from the Hemis. In the case of Chrysler, they actually took the existing Hemi short block, the lower end of the engine, and they adapted a polyspherical cylinder head to it to create a lower cost engine. And of course, it was a less efficient chamber, so it had lower power as well. It was for some of the vehicles that had milder horsepower requirements for family sedans and so forth. So the 354, you could actually get the Hemi option or the polyspherical option for lower cost, which was interesting. But again, the bottom end of the short block was the same engine. Now in 1957 and 58, Chrysler redesigned their Hemi, and it was a similar design to the 331 and the 354, but it came out in 392 cubic inches. Now this engine was, for its day, a real powerhouse, and it was a taller deck block. They increased the height of the block. They added about a ½ inch to the height of the block so they could get a longer stroke into it. The 392 had a 4-inch bore and a 3.905 stroke with a deck height of 10-inch 870 thousandths. Now because the decks were taller, they were further apart. Some of the other manufacturers, when they made taller deck blocks of the same family, like the Ford 302, 351 example, they made a wider intake to put on top of the engine. Chrysler did something a little different than that. They actually made a Hemi head that had a wider stance to it so they could use their existing 331 and 354 intakes on it. So it had a different cylinder head that made up the distance between the intake ports from one side to the other. So I thought that was an interesting concept. The 392 had 4 different horsepower ranges, starting with 325 horsepower and a 4-barrel carburetor. They also had a 4-barrel carbureted version that made 345 horsepower, and the way that they achieved more horsepower is they bumped the compression of the engine up from 8.5 to 1 to 9.5 to 1. 375 horsepower, which had 2 4-barrel carburetors on it and a high flow intake. And they actually had a 390 version of the 392 that was fuel injected. Now, it was electronic fuel injected, which was like unheard of in the day. The first electronic fuel injection. Chevrolet had done fuel injection on their Corvettes, but that was mechanical fuel injection. Chrysler actually did an electronic fuel injection. Unfortunately, even though the engine made 390 horsepower in testing, when they actually put the electronic fuel injected 392 out, making 390 horsepower, it was actually a dismal failure. Every single one of the 390 horsepower Chrysler electronic fuel injected 392s was recalled and replaced with dual carburetors because the fuel injection just did not work. Now, you do have to give them credit though for giving that a try. They were the first ones to actually put electronic fuel injection on a car, and that was in 1959. So that was a very, very innovative design at the time. Unfortunately, they just didn't really have the correct electronics to make it work. The electronic fuel injection that was on those cars was made by Bendix, and it was called the Electrotronic. This was produced in the 1958 Chrysler 300D. If you actually find a 300D from 58 that was originally a fuel injected unit, you've got an extremely rare car. There are a few people that have actually restored those cars and put the fuel injection unit back on, but they're basically just a show car. They don't really, it's not really something that you would drive because the fuel injection system just didn't work very good. 392 was also very popular at the time with drag racers. Many of the popular NHRA drag racers at the time took the 392, modified it, and made real advancements in very powerful drag racing engines. So they were big into racing. The saying was, win on Sunday, sell on Monday. So a lot of the manufacturers had gotten into not only NHRA but NASCAR at the time, and so they were heavily into that. I'm not going to get really detailed into the racing side of what they did because that's a whole nother series of videos, but they were definitely involved in a lot of the big race series like NASCAR and NHRA. All right, now the next series of engines we need to look at was the engines that they built for the DeSoto. Now the DeSoto was more of a family car. It wasn't really designed to be something that you would consider a sports car. It was a very large car, and it was very roomy and luxurious, and it was more geared toward the American family sedan, even though they did have 2-door versions of it that were a little bit sporty. The DeSoto Hemis had very little in common with the Chrysler Hemis. Almost nothing was interchangeable because, like I said, it was a different engineering team that designed this car. They had the same basic premise of the Hemi, but they really didn't compare notes. They actually had their own design team. Even though they were under the same umbrella or company of Chrysler, they were in a separate design mode and they really didn't communicate with each other too much. The first DeSoto Hemi was produced in 1952. The DeSoto Hemis were known as the Fire Dome Hemis. The first one they produced in 1952 was 276 cubic inches, and it put out a whopping 160 horsepower. Not something to really write home about. Now, a lot of the Hemis that we talk about, for the smaller cubic inch Hemis from Dodge, Chrysler, and DeSoto, Plymouth didn't have their own Hemi. They used, we'll talk about them later, but they really didn't have their own Hemi. They used the Dodge Hemis and the Plymouths. They actually used a couple of Chrysler Hemis too. The DeSoto was a lower cost brand designed to be marketed to young families. And so they didn't have real high horsepower engines. They didn't have real fancy luxury cars. They were just a bare bones basic car to get from A to B. But of course they did have to have a reliable engine, although they didn't have very much power. So like I said, a lot of the smaller cubic inch engines that had lower horsepower, a lot of people never heard of these because back in the day, most of them were only made for a couple of years, and they were such low horsepower. Nobody really looked at engines like the 276 Hemi and said, hey, the 276 has 160 horsepower. I think I'll take that and make a hot rod out of it. They just didn't do that. A lot of the smaller cubic inch Hemis just went away. They got scrapped. Nobody really saved them. There are a few around that have been restored, but for the most part, they weren't popular with racing or aftermarket, custom designed street machines and so forth. And so you don't really hear a lot about these today because they don't exist anymore. They just went away. They just weren't powerful enough or big enough to be sought after. The 276 had a 3.625 bore and a 3.344 stroke. So a relatively small bore and stroke, especially considering the size and the weight of the engine. But nevertheless, it was a Hemi. In 1955, they produced the 291 cubic inch engine. Now this basically was the same engine as the 276, but with a larger bore. They took the 276, they bored it out to 3.720, and it retained the same stroke of 3.344 as the 276. The 291 Hemi and the DeSoto produced 175 horsepower. Again, nothing to write home about, but again, it was a lower cost family sedan. In 1956, the Fire Dome engine got a raised deck and they increased the cubic inches to 291. Now there are a few of these around. I've seen a few of these in restoration vehicles, and so it is possible that you could see some of these. They increased the bore to 3-inch 800 thousandths. It was a taller deck block. It had the same stroke as the previous two Hemis, and it produced 200 horsepower. In 1956, they produced the 341 cubic inch Hemi. It had a bore of 3.780 and a stroke of 3.800. They had a hypo version of this engine that actually 325 horsepower. It was a high compression version that had 2 carburetors, which was actually pretty decent power for the day and considering this cubic inches of the engine. Next, they had a 345 cubic inch Hemi. This was a square motor. It had a 3-inch 800 thousandths bore and a 3-inch 800 thousandths stroke. It was the only Chrysler Hemi that ever had a square bore and stroke. It produced 345 horsepower, which is 1 horsepower per cubic inch, which is very respectable for the day. And that was with dual Carter 4-barrel AFBs and 9-to-1 compression. The 345 was the largest Hemi that DeSoto ever produced in any of their cars, and it was actually something that was used by some of the hot rodders of the day. They modified it because it was a pretty decent engine. Even though it was a square motor, it did make decent power in hot rod. Now the Dodge branch of Chrysler produced their Hemi engine starting in 1953. Plymouth was the lowest, or the economy version of the Chrysler line, and then Dodge was the next one up from that. Dodge had the smallest cubic inches and the lowest horsepower Hemis, but they did have Hemis. The Plymouth got the polyspherical engine, which was less expensive. In 1953, there was a series of engines produced for the Dodge vehicles known as the Red Ram Hemis. Now the Red Ram Hemis had nothing in common or nothing interchangeable with the DeSoto or the Chrysler Hemis. They were a Hemi in design, but as far as interchangeability goes, there was nothing. It was a different engine. They called this the poor man's Hemi. If you didn't want to settle for the polyspherical Plymouth or a 6-cylinder Plymouth, you could jump up to the Dodge line, which was a lot less expensive than a DeSoto or a Chrysler, but it was still affordable if you were on a budget. Now they did offer all of the Dodge vehicles with a polyspherical engine as well. You had the option of getting the Hemi-headed engine or the polyspherical engine, which was less expensive, but it was kind of the transitionary brand that offered both, whereas the Plymouth only offered the less expensive and lower powered polyspherical engines. The first engine that Dodge produced that was a Hemi was in 1953, and it was a 241 cubic inch. Now this was a physically large Hemi, basically the same size as all of the rest of them, but it had a very dinky displacement. Small bore, short stroke. It had a tiny 3.437 bore, less than 3.5 inches, and the stroke was a measly 3.25 inches. So this was, it almost seemed ridiculous to have such a small bore and stroke in a Hemi engine, but you know, they did it. So 241 cubic inches, pretty small engine. It had 7-to-1 compression ratio, and it boasted a whopping 140 horsepower. Nothing to write home about. They did make a 150 horsepower version of it with higher compression, but even so, 150 horsepower just was pretty disappointing power-wise for any of these cars. These cars back in the 50s were pretty heavy, and 150 horsepower. There were actually flathead 6-cylinders that had more horsepower than that in some of the other manufacturers' vehicles. In 55, they bumped the cubic inches up by casting the block with a bigger bore. It was a 3.650 bore, but it retained the same stroke as the 241, which was 3.25 inches or 3.250. The 270 did a little better. It had 183 horsepower with a 2-barrel carburetor. You could order an optional 4-barrel carburetor and a higher compression version that had 193 horsepower. In 1956, Dodge cast a raised deck height block, just like the other manufacturers did, and they built this into a 315 cubic inch Hemi. It had the same bore as the 270, 3.625, but they increased the stroke to 3.800. It was a significant jump in stroke for this engine. And you could get an optional dual 4-barrel version of this engine that was 1 horsepower per cubic inch. It was rated at 315 horsepower. So that was actually not bad. When you get up over 300 horsepower, you got something that's, for the day, that was something that was pretty decent. They also had a 325 cubic inch that was considered their high performance engine. They called this the Super Red Ram engine. It had a bore of 3.687 and a 3-inch 800,000 stroke, which is the same stroke as the 315. They just made it with a larger bore. With dual carburetors, a high flow intake manifold, a high lift camshaft, and high flow exhaust was available in a 320 horsepower version. The thing about the Dodge engines, you could get any of these in either a Hemi head or a poly head. You had the option. The polyspherical head engine was lower horsepower, but it was definitely less expensive than the Hemi or the dual rocker shaft engine that they called it. Now, the Dodge engines were also used in a lot of the Dodge pickup truck in these various cubic inches. But, you know, all in all, these engines were not really anything that were sought after. They were small bore, small stroke engines. You never really heard of anybody taking these engines and modifying them and building them for performance. It just wasn't something that was done, because the Chrysler and the DeSoto Hemis, the Chrysler Hemis especially, were readily available, and they were capable of making much more power. And so those were the ones that were selected for the aftermarket guys, the street rod guys, the racers, the NASCAR guys, the drag racers. Dodge did have a Hemi, although it was very big and bulky and heavy and just unimpressive. And that rounds out the Generation 1 Hemi, and that brings us to, of course, the Generation 2 Hemi. In 1960, all of these early Hemis disappeared, and Chrysler actually didn't make another Hemi until the 426 came out. What's interesting about the Generation 2 426 Hemi, which we'll talk about here in a minute, is that they only had one version. They only had one Hemi. They had a 426. That was it. They didn't build any other cubic inch, no other bore and stroke combination. It was just the 426. And originally was strictly built for racing, but they ended up having to produce it in production cars in order to qualify to race it in NASCAR. By 1960, All of the earlier A Hemis were gone. They went to small block engines and to basically the polyspherical small block, which we'll talk about later. In 1964, the second generation Hemi was born. Chrysler revived the Hemi and they built what is famously known now as the 426 cubic inch Hemi. 64 was actually the first time Chrysler ever called that engine a Hemi. Back in the early days of the Hemi, like we just talked about, they didn't actually call that engine a Hemi. They called it a dual rocker arm engine, and the polyspherical was the single rocker arm engine. In 1964, Chrysler trademarked the name Hemi and they released the 426 Hemi. Now, this was a race-only engine that was built specifically for NASCAR. In the 1964 Daytona 500, the Hemi absolutely dominated. It just destroyed the rest of the field. The first three places were Hemis, Plymouths, and Dodges with Hemis in them. 1, 2, and 3 place was the 426 Hemi. Fourth place was a Ford, and fifth and sixth, I believe, was also a Plymouth and a Dodge. Richard Petty won that race. It was his first Daytona 500 win, and he won by an entire lap. Nowadays, you watch NASCAR races, and it's usually a photo finish. They're right next to each other. He was an entire lap ahead of the entire field, which just goes to show you how dominant that engine was. Well, after the race, some of the other car companies, Ford specifically, started raising a stink and wanted the Hemi banned. And they had a legitimate claim, but the reason they did this is because they couldn't compete with that Hemi. They knew they were going to get destroyed by this thing. So Ford basically said, hey, that's not a production engine. The rules say that you have to have at least 500 of those engines in production cars sold to the public in order for them to qualify to be raced in NASCAR. And they were correct. At that point, the Hemi was never offered available to the public. NASCAR actually banned the Hemi and Chrysler in 1965 and said, no, it's not a production engine, you can't run it. So Chrysler just basically pulled out of NASCAR for a year. They were not involved in NASCAR racing in 1965. A year later, in 1966, they offered the 426 Hemi for sale to customers, to the public. The 426 Hemi was an absolute monster of an engine. They deemed it the elephant motor because it was so big. Now, some of the Chevy guys picked up on this and they said, well, you know, the reason that they call it an elephant motor is because elephants are afraid of mice, right? And the small block Chevy was considered the mouse engine. That is not why it got the name elephant motor. To say that a factory OEM small block Chevy could even come close to competing with the 426 Hemi is just ridiculous. Now, the Hemi in stock form, the street version of the Hemi was quite a bit tamer than the NASCAR version. It had lower compression. It was a pump gas version of the 426 Hemi. But in 1966, the 426 Hemi that was available in just about every Plymouth and Dodge available was rated at 425 horsepower and 490 foot-pounds of torque. However, independent dyno testing actually put the horsepower output of the Hemi closer to 500. Now this is documented and it's been repeated multiple times. The dual carburetor version with factory intake, factory heads, no porting, no mods, factory valves, factory configuration, pistons, connecting rods, crank, factory bore and stroke have consistently dynoed around 500 horsepower. The torque has been documented around 515. So the engine was highly underrated, much like the LS6 454. It was a 454 Chevy. It was quite a bit underrated as well. Because of insurance purposes and so forth, in those days they just decided let's rate it at 425. Now in 66, when the elephant motor or the 426 Hemi was produced, it had the largest bore spacing of any big block engine that had been produced up to that time. Later on, Ford came out with a bigger one in their 385 series, but at this point the Hemi was the granddaddy of the bore spacing and the cylinder bore capability and size. Because of the elaborate valve train that the Hemi heads had, they had these really wide, huge cylinder heads and big, intimidating looking valve covers. So it was a very, not only was it a powerful, just an absolute brute of a motor, when you pop the hood, it was very intimidating looking as well. And when it was sitting in the front of a dragster or a drag car, it was very intimidating as well, especially with a supercharger sitting on top of it. The 426 Hemi had a 4.250 bore, standard bore, and a 3.750 stroke. So it had a big bore, short stroke. Because of the shorter 3.750 stroke, it was actually able to rev pretty good. It had a pretty high red line, over 6,000. The street version had 10.5 to 1 compression, which of course is much different than the NASCAR version, had 12.5 to 1 compression. The 426 Hemi has become legendary, and actually the vehicles out there that have the factory 426 Hemi in them, there was one recently that Barrett Jackson went for $3.5 million. So they've basically become a collector's item. It's not really something that you're going to go out and, buy and drive daily unless you're, rich. And it was only produced in factory production cars for 5 years, from 66 to 71. By 1972, the emissions and the EPA requirements and the gas mileage requirements basically just killed the Hemi. It disappeared, and we didn't see another Hemi until we got to the Gen 3 Hemis later on. Now, the Generation 3 Hemis is another video. That's a whole nother video in and of itself. I'm not going to put it in this video because it's just too much information to divulge, and it's going to make this video really long. But suffice it to say that in its day, the 426 Hemi was the granddaddy of the street engines. It was something that gained a reputation very quickly. When a 426 powered Cuda or Challenger came up next to you at the stoplight, you didn't bother. You didn't even try. There was only a couple of factory cars that could actually give the 426 Hemi powered cars a run for their money. One of them was the LS6 1970 SS 454, which was a pretty even match for the Hemi powered cars. But other than that, there really wasn't anything that could touch this thing on the street. Now, later on, when we get into the later model Hemis, the Generation 3 Hemis, the horsepower numbers are through the ceiling. It's going to make the numbers of these earlier engines look silly. So the Hemi really has come a long way in Generation 3. It really was a very advanced engine. And we're going to talk about that in the next video. Now, the big block Chrysler wedge engines, the 383, the 413, the 400, the 440 line of engines, which we'll get into in another video, was a very, very closely related block with the 426 Hemi. Now, the 426 Hemi had some subtle differences. It had cross-bolted mains because they had a lot of cap walk at high RPM, so that was like a NASCAR deal. They also had, in the lifter valley, they had some bolt bosses for the wider 426 Hemi head. But if you look at a 426 Hemi block and say a 440 block, they're identical. They were basically engineered exactly like one another with just some subtle differences. So once we get into the small blocks and the B and the RB big blocks, that's probably all going to be one video. The wedge type small block and the wedge big blocks together in one video. But I wanted to keep the Hemi separate from that. And then of course the Gen 3 Hemi is going to be a video all its own. So I hope you stay tuned. We are going to get into a lot of that. The big block Chrysler wedge type motors, the 426 wedge, which was the wedge version of the 426 Hemi, those engines were actually very formidable powerhouses as well. They had a lot of influence in the performance world and in passenger cars and pickup trucks. We will get into that in some of the future videos that we're going to do. Thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you very soon.